Hello, I'm Maria Titizian, and welcome to Examining the Context, EVN Report's monthly podcast, where we unpack key themes and developments in Armenia's evolving security landscape. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the June 2025 EVN Security Report titled Armenia, the 12-Day War and Strategic Ambiguity. It analyzes the implications of the recent Israel-Iran war, a 12-day conflict that included a dramatic U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, and examines how Armenia is navigating a moment of heightened volatility. What are the risks of spillover for Armenia? How might the U.S. role in the conflict complicate Yerevan's diplomatic balancing act? What direction should Armenia's foreign and security policy be headed? And how can Armenia manage this complex situation while mitigating its own vulnerabilities? To break it all down, I'm joined by Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, who is the author of our monthly security reports. Welcome to the program, Nerses.
Great to be here, Maria.
So let's start with the basics. You, at length, wrote about the significance of this 12-day war between Israel and Iran, why it matters for Armenia, how it exposed Armenia's vulnerability or tested its geopolitical balancing act. I think it's pretty obvious to most of us that Armenia is between two very difficult, or what is the saying, a rock and a hard place. So let's set the scene, if you will.
Okay, so three different layers of issues here at hand. First is we need to understand that the 12-day war did not happen in a vacuum, nor is it a one-off event. It's part of a continuous process. So in that context, what we could anticipate is that it's a matter of time before hostilities are reinitiated.
So you're saying that this is not over?
No, absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
As I discussed in the security report last month, Iran cannot stop its nuclear program or completely abdicate it. It's not going to work. That's not how the regime operates. And there are numerous issues involved with that. First of all, for 20 years, they've invested almost $500 billion in the program. Secondly, if the regime gives up the program, which they view as their ultimate form of deterrence against their regional enemies, they will look domestically weak. And so there's a growing concern that the regime is basically becoming a paper tiger. If they, in fact, do concede and give up their program, they are going to have domestic stability issues.
Do you think that people in Iran care about the nuclear program?
It's not a question of specifically caring about it, but if this has been the dominant narrative advanced by the regime in projecting Iranian power, and then all of a sudden, by virtue of Israel having free reign over your airspace, bombing you at will, and then forcing you to give up that deterrent capacity, that makes you look extraordinarily weak domestically. And also, when you're yelling, debt to America and debt to Israel for 40 years, and then those actors basically expose you as, a regime that's not even able to, at the most minimal level, advance its security interests, those will have domestic repercussions. And so, the regime in Iran projects domestic power and regional power. Its regional projection capacity has completely diminished, but its domestic projection capacity has not sufficiently diminished. If they give up the nuclear program and basically concede to the demands of Israel and then the United States, this would have a detrimental effect on the regime. So by virtue of those developments, they simply cannot give up on the nuclear program. They have invested too much into it as far as economically, resource-wise, policy-wise, and the regime's credibility as well. Israel and the United States, on the other hand, can never accept an Iran with a nuclear program or with nuclear weapons, right?
Unless there's a regime change.
Even if there is a regime change, United States and Israel will not accept an Iran that has nuclear arms.
Why?
Because one, that there's the whole logic of the non-proliferation discourse that unstable regimes or regimes that pose a threat to strategic American and Western interests, and Israel happens to be part of that security architecture, United States will not allow this.
So let me ask a very simple question. So it's okay for Pakistan and North Korea to have nukes?
It's not okay. It's not okay.
Right. But they couldn't prevent it.
Right. The United States found out after the fact that Pakistani scientists had been basically covertly supporting the North Korean nuclear program. And when it was found out that North Korea had already established nuclear capacity and weaponized it, this was obviously terrifying for the United States and the West. But it was too late. but we see the immense level of sanctions that have been carried out against North Korea, and North Korea is a really extraordinarily poor hermit state. But they found out about this after the fact, and therefore their capacity to punish North Korea remains limited. If Iran is able to develop a nuclear weapon, the approach would be the same, but it would be too late from the perspective of the United States and their Western partners. This is why, as I noted, they are going to do everything they can not to allow Iran to develop nuclear capacity.
So we're going to be in a perpetual cycle of violence, because, as you put it, one refuses to give up the program, the other two refuses it to
accept it. And this is the conundrum we speak of in the article. And so from that context, right, Israel last week declared their policy that they reserve the right to basically hit any target in Iran that they qualify as being part of Iran attempting to redevelop their capacity. Now, what Israel's also doing is they're basically stretching this policy a little further and wider and saying not simply nuclear capacity, but also ballistic missile capacity and so on and so forth. And in that context, right, what we're seeing is an underlying policy by Israel, which is clearly supported by the United States, that basically stipulates the following. Because they can't tolerate a nuclear Iran, and because they know this regime will never give up the nuclear program, for the U.S.-Israeli tandem, the one way of getting rid of the nuclear program is to get rid of the regime. So fundamentally, while not in the immediate, the long-term objective remains regime change, because they equate regime change with getting rid of Iran's nuclear program. Whether this will succeed or not is a different subject of conversation. But within the domain of U.S. and Israeli policymaking and the implications of that policy, we see, as you noted, a perpetuity in conflict until either side achieves their objective. Now, if Iran is able to develop nuclear weapons somehow, then that changes the dynamic, because then they will have nuclear deterrence. And Israel cannot go along doing what it does, and the United States will be really constrained. And so the North Korea example kind of comes into this dynamic. But until either of those developments are attained, Iran nuclear capacity or regime change, Armenia faces a continuous conundrum to itself.
Right, absolutely. And just one more point before we talk about ourselves, which is what the podcast is about. You know, I did a podcast last week with Dr. Arek Danagulyan, nuclear scientist or physicist, and he said, look, you can't kill science. You can't kill knowledge. And so they could go in, Mossad can go in and target all the scientists they want. And he said something else, that, you know, the nuclear bomb, if you will, is 1960s technology. It's not that difficult.
Definitely.
To do. So, I mean, this is why...
And it aligns with the argument that's being made, right? And Dr. Donagulyan is completely correct on this. You can't kill knowledge. And so Iran has this knowledge. And so it's a question of political will. Mm-hmm. If you remove the regime from the perspective of the U.S.-Israeli tandem, and you get a regime there that understands they should not be developing a nuclear weapon, then that technology would not be utilized. South Africa, for example, had the capacity to develop nuclear weapons, but they gave up their program because they didn't want to have issues with, you know, the non-proliferation treaty and all those other things. So the logic is that, similar to South Africa, a new Iranian regime will understand that it'll be more commensurate with their interests if they don't have a nuclear program and are integrated into the Western-supported international system. Right. That is the thinking coming out of Tel Aviv, Brussels, and D.C. Whether that's correct or not is a different subject of conversation.
Whether that's naive or not is another subject for conversation. But let's return to our chickens, as we say in Armenian. Okay.
But to make the point that a regime in Iran that does not view Israel and the United States as existential threats, a non-theocratic regime from the perspective of the West, is a regime that they can work with, where they could relieve sanctions, support them economically, and in return, they would not proceed in pursuing a nuclear program. And so the thinking is that if we could have a non-theocratic regime that could be integrated into Western markets, not have the security threat that it right now feels from the West, if all those things could be alleviated, then they could possibly have a solution. So from their lens, right, regime change makes it a lot more possible to deny and convince a potential leadership from pursuing that program than it exists in the current format. This is the thinking coming out of DC, Tel Aviv, and Brussels.
Well, coming back to our issues. So in the security report, you write that Armenia's policy as it stands and going forward should be, will be, must be defined by what you call strategic ambiguity. In this case, is neutrality a viable option for Armenia?
So
and also, let's put it into context for those listeners who might not understand Armenia's conundrum.
So, we see the terms neutral and balancing used a lot. This is not the concepts that we're talking about. This is not specific to the situation at hand. Armenia's conundrum, as I noted, is extremely severe because if you have continuous conflict to the south, Armenia is surrounded by predatory neighbors that are blockading it, right, to the east and the west. Its only access is north through Georgia and south through Iran. The southern access to Iran in of itself is problematic because the regime is sanctioned, Iran is sanctioned, so Armenia is limited in what it could do down south. Now, if you have conflict down south and you have this perpetual state of intermittent violence between the U.S.-Israeli tandem and Iran, it creates instability to its southern logistical routes, which places Armenia even in more of a difficult and impossible situation. And this is what we're talking about, on the one hand. Second, Armenia has extraordinarily strong and growing relations with the United States, which is critical when it comes to its regional security architecture and the danger that it faces from Azerbaijan. At the same time, it also has very strong pragmatic relations with Iran. And so Armenia cannot, be put in a position where it has to choose sides. Either of that situation is fundamentally against Armenia's strategic interest. So it's not simply an issue of neutrality. Neutrality creates distrust from your partners, okay? When we talk about balancing entails a certain level of capacity that a small state like Armenia does not have. So
or
balancing,
agency.
Right, absolutely. So balancing and neutrality as concepts are not really applicable. I know a lot of people, analysts, use the terms very loosely, but within a domain of international relations, specifically in the domain of international security studies, these are very complex concepts. And so Armenia's approach, in what I discuss in the article, and will be the policy of the foreign ministry, is one of strategic ambiguity. Note that neutrality is a position. It's clear. Ambiguity is not. It allows for
it's ambiguous.
Exactly. It allows for a lot of flexibility. So if Armenia says we are neutral, for example, it declares this, the United States might ask, for example, what does your neutrality entail? Or Iran might come and say, what does your neutrality entail? And that puts Armenia in a very, very difficult situation. Okay? But what strategic ambiguity does is that it allows us a very wide scope of deliberate ambiguity where when it comes to decision-making processes, operations, or policy positions, we do not concretely have to tell either side what our position is because it is in our strategic interest to be vague. Because when you have clarity of position on an impossible situation, sooner or later you're going to find yourself in a trap.
Sorry, I'm going to stop you. So neutrality entails having a position while strategic ambiguity does not?
Strategic ambiguity allows you to have flexibility to deny the demand of having a position. And so it is an inverse form of it. It is an inverse method of thing using diplomatic tactics.
So give me an example of what the language might look like. If I'm being strategically ambiguous toward Washington, if Washington comes to Armenia and says, look, you have to have a stronger position on Iran's nuclear program.
Right. So first, we need to understand that strategic ambiguity it's a mechanism, of directly avoiding being sucked into a conflict, being party to a conflict, or being forced to choose side between two warring powers. As I noted, that is the first objective. Now, with respect to language, I discussed extensively in the article, the language must be defined by risk-averse logic. Because Armenia finds itself in basically a situation where it's a lose-lose configuration. Mm-hmm. So within that domain, if you exercise strategic ambiguity, a lot of the discourse or the modality of speaking revolves around, for example, concepts of demanding peace from both sides or offering to serve as a bridge for both sides, or trying to contribute to some level of mutual restraint from both sides, or talking about supporting post-conflict stabilization, or participating and supporting humanitarian concerns, so on and so forth. So Armenia's objective is to speak and promote policies that basically revolve around these ambiguous precepts, as opposed to being put in a position where they have to choose sides. So in your example, you said, what happens if, for example, the United States comes and says, what is Armenia's position on Iran's nuclear program? Armenia's position within the domain of strategic ambiguity would be not to address directly Iran, but basically talk about how Armenia is a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and therefore, throughout the world, Armenia opposes the spread of nuclear weapons because nuclear weapons are harmful, dangerous, they're weapons of mass destruction, so on and so forth, right? So you could take a position, but have enough ambiguity that gives you flexibility with the other partner.
You have high expectations of our state officials.
It's not a question of high expectations, to be honest, because as I discuss in the article, right, bilateral relations with Iran or bilateral relations with the United States are not based on strategic ambiguity. These are relations that are based on a lot of clarity and substantive positioning. What we're talking about in this context is it's known as situational ambiguity. So Armenia becomes ambiguous within the domain of a conflict between these two actors. And these conflicts, right, can be for 10 days, it could be for 5 days, it could keep happening, but during the times of crises, right? During times of crises, Armenia's approach has to be situational ambiguity. So it's not a question of what is Armenia's relationship with Iran. That is not ambiguous. Or what is Armenia's relationship with the United States. That is not ambiguous. But when the two sides start fighting, or for, let's say, a 5-day period, 7-day period, United States and Israel start bombing Iran, during those periods of crises, Armenia's position has to be defined by situational ambiguity.
As far as you know, Nerses, up until this point, from what we've seen from after the 12-day war, there seems to be a relative calm at the moment. There's no bombs flying, there's no missiles, etc. What are the potential pressures that could be placed upon Yerevan? Knowing what we know, I understand that our bilateral relations with both are solid, as solid as possible. But what are the potential issues that you can...
Right. It depends on the extent to which the conflict escalates, right? If we have something within the confines of the 12-day war, or you have basically a prolonged period of aerial bombing, and there is no probability of ground forces, so on and so forth, then the pressure points on Armenia are going to be very, very limited. The United States, for example, will never pressure Armenia to close its border with Iran. Okay, the United States will not ask Armenia to operate against Iran. The United States understands this, right? And they know that Armenia cannot do this. The United States will not ask Armenia to make releases or public statements that condemn or attack Iran. Okay, so in this context, the United States is very realistic in Armenia's capabilities. But what the United States can expect, some of the pressure points might be behind the scenes, right? Requests, for example, for Armenia to engage in intelligence sharing, which will be a very difficult issue for Armenia, okay? Or they could, for example, ask Armenia to allow certain American presence in the south, near Mehri, to be able to observe what's going on, the inflow of Iranian refugees. Are these refugees, are they not refugees, so on and so forth, right? So there might be sort of, requests by the United States as a strategic partner to allow, asking Armenia to support them in some of these endeavors. And those are things that may come, but again, if Armenia has a position of situational ambiguity, they can buy enough time, or they could sort of tacitly push back on these demands until the fighting stops.
Which seems to be, realistic, because I can't see a prolonged, months-long
Definitely
thing,
not.
right?
Definitely
so it's going to be short bursts of...
Yeah. If this was similar to what we're seeing in Ukraine happening in the south, then strategic ambiguity would not work, because then you're talking about a conflict that's for continuous and for years. But because this is situational, it allows us this flexibility. Iran's request, I think, at most would basically be along the lines of, don't support the West. Right? Don't basically help them out when they ask you. And this is very important to understand. It doesn't matter whether Armenia wants Iran to be successful in the conflict or whether for the US-Israeli tandem to destroy the nuclear program or for there to be regime change or for whether for the regime to continue. It doesn't matter what Armenia wants. And I'm not saying he wants either of these things, right? Because the fact of the matter is that Armenia has no agency in this. So our diplomatic thinking, our strategic thinking has to revolve around the fact that we have no agency or control over this process. But what we can do, right, is limit the damage, right, the spillover effect onto Armenia. And the best way of mitigating that is to exercise ambiguity during periods of conflict. So every other situation that comes up during those periods of conflict, right, what Armenia can do is exercise this flexibility when either of its partners makes requests. Also, if you don't have a policy position that is very rigid, it becomes a little difficult for a partner to come and ask you to do something where you've never had in the past a precedent of acting in that direction. So all of these are kind of important in basically allowing Armenia to try to leave itself out of it and not to be entangled into the conflict. And I discuss in the article, right, we have two objectives through strategic ambiguity. The first objective is to avoid entanglement. The second objective is not to have defection from either of the partners. Okay?
Not to have what?
Defection from either of the partners, meaning...
In your bilateral relationships?
Right, exactly. So for the United States, for example, to have problems and harm relations, or for Iran to do it, right? We call that a modality of defection in scholarship. So if you can avoid entanglement, and if you can avoid defection from your partners, you have succeeded with respect to mitigating your losses. Because as I discuss in the article, in the domain, right, of risk propensity, Armenia finds itself in a lose-lose configuration. Not a win-win or a win-lose, but a lose-lose configuration when you have conflict in the south. That means there is no probability of any gain. The best case scenario is mitigating loss.
Not to drown, to keep the boat afloat, if you will.
Right, exactly.
What spillover effect could there be for Armenia other than what you mentioned domestically?
There won't be much a spillover effect domestically, but some of the concerns are possibly a refugee crisis, humanitarian crisis, complete severing of logistical routes down south. For example, if Israel decides to bomb roads and basically transit routes, then trade stops with Iran, right? Access south to Iran and then into rest of the Persian Gulf and on to India becomes disrupted, right? Armenia's ability, for example, to fly in weapons from India becomes basically stalled. So those could produce a lot of problems for us, right? If down south...
And we have no other means to diversify our economic lifelines. I mean, it would only remain with
Exactly. That you find
Georgia.
yourself in a further dependency structure with respect to transit routes and access up north. So those are some very obvious spillover effects. Furthermore, assuming, for example, that United States and Israel continue with this policy, the probability of regime change, while being rather low in these kind of situations, can also possibly lead to civil wars, right? And that would be a complete nightmare for Armenia, because civil wars then are not situational. They are long, they are
Prolonged,
unpredictable, and they produce immense problems.
And Iran, we were talking about this the other day, Nerses. If you look at the Kurdish population, if you look at the Azerbaijanis living there, we're talking about millions, right? I mean, it could spark
Most definitely, yeah.
internal turmoil like we've never seen.
Ethnically, Iran is not monolithic, right? It's not as homogenous as other societies. 90% of Iranian society is not ethnically Persian. And so clearly there are a lot of those concerns as well. Also in Iran, you have institutional concerns, right? The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, serves as a Praetorian Guard that basically protects the interests of what they call the revolution, which is basically the regime and the values of the revolution. That is not what the regular armed forces do in Iran. That is not what a lot of the police do in Iran. So in Iran, you have basically a two-tiered parallel security apparatus. One that basically serves the broader national interest, and one that basically deals with regime survival. The one that deals with regime survival, regime preservation, is the strongest and the best funded and developed one. So if one of those parallel structures is sufficiently diminished, interinstitutional instability is also possible because the Iranian army is separate from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. So should you have domestic instability, it's going to be very difficult for the Praetorian Guard infrastructure to suppress domestic uprisings. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but when we look at a lot of the literature on these kinds of things, specifically on civil wars and potential situations of a failed state strategy, these become serious problems, and that the Iranian state might not have the capacity to suppress uprisings if the apparatus of suppression, which is the Revolutionary Guard, has been severely diminished by Israeli and American airstrikes. So there also becomes an issue of capacity, and if you have a situation like that, and then there's domestic civil war in Iran, that becomes a serious nightmare for Armenia. Yeah. That's also another spillover that we have to be very, very concerned about.
Right, and just very quickly, perhaps unrelated, but the decimation of Iran's proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, have these impacted the regime domestically?
Absolutely. Iran's concept of the Shia crescent or the axis of resistance fundamentally revolved around Iran's proxies basically circling Israel, right? Hezbollah being one of their biggest and most heavily invested proxies, and then proxy groups in Syria. The Assad regime had become a quasi-satellite of Iran because they helped with their survival during the post-Arab Spring civil war, and then, of course, the proxies in Iraq and the Houthis in Yemen. But Hezbollah was the most well-developed, strongest proxy that it had. It was basically a military extension of the Revolutionary Guard. And so the relative decimation of Hezbollah and the loss of Syria completely ruptured the Shia crescent. And that obviously completely weakened the asymmetrical tools that Iran had in advancing its regional interests. And it was also a byproduct of the weakening or the demolishing of these proxies that also made Iran so vulnerable. And so after Israel did what they did with Hezbollah, and after what happened in Syria, Iran was left with basically a small toolkit. And that was its ballistic missile capacity to deter Israeli attacks. And obviously that was not a sufficient deterrent.
Mm-hmm. Well, what should Armenian decision makers today be thinking about in terms of preparedness and positioning, other than strategic ambiguity? You talked about potential civil wars and all of that. And should this war resume or widen or deepen? Is there some analysis being done, some positioning being thought of?
Right. That's a good question. So right now, we're in the process of developing extensive contingency planning on various scenarios. Clearly, intermittent violence is the most obvious scenario that we're dealing with, and situational ambiguity addresses that. Issues of civil war, issues of humanitarian crisis, inflow of refugees, those are also the different scenarios that we're dealing with. Human security differs from the other modalities of security that we're dealing with. So there are definitely contingency plans being developed on that. But as far as Armenia's ability to implement or absorb or deal with these problems, that's a different matter, right? Hypothetically, let's say you end up having a civil war, right? Now you have a two-tiered problem. One, the entirety of your south is in a state of instability. So this disrupts much of your economic engagements with Iran. At the same time, civil wars always lead to mass refugee crises, right? So what happens if 200, 300,000, 400,000 Iranians cross into Armenia? That's basically more than 15-20% of Armenia's population. How do you absorb that? How do you deal with that? So there are a lot of issues of this sort that contingency planning is being developed to possibly mitigate if this happens. And of course, Western partners are going to play a crucial role in this as well, because Armenia by itself cannot address these problems. So there is definitely proactive forward thinking on these developments. But the most important approach is for Armenia to consistently communicate with both sides.
That was what I just wrote, actually, for my next question is Yerevan communicating with Tehran, with DC, with, I don't know, Tel Aviv, if it needs to or
I'm
not?
not going to speak on behalf of the
Sure,
government,
of
of course, but I'm most certain that there is consistent communication on this matter with both sides, because Armenia's strong relations with both partners could actually be constructive in trying to address many of these issues. And so if Armenia could elevate its relevance as a bridge between the two, I think it enhances or gives us some agency when a conflict would break out, because it's one thing to not really have a dialogue with a partner on a certain situation, and then when that situation happens, both sides don't know how to talk about the given development. But if you've had continuous conversations together, planning together, understandings together, and a situation does break out, then you are better situated in addressing it. So Armenia is most definitely having communication with both partners when it comes to the situation.
Well, Nerses, thank you. It was, I say this all the time, but it was a very interesting approach, and strategic ambiguity is a term that for me was interesting, because you're right. Sometimes we conflate ambiguity with neutrality and all of that. So it's very important for us to understand those differences and to understand what our options are.
Definitely. And just to make a point, strategic ambiguity for large states is very different than strategic ambiguity for small states. For example, and the concept's been around for some time, the way United States, for example, uses strategic ambiguity is very different. A perfect example is Taiwan, right? When there are questions, for example, would the United States attack China if China invades Taiwan? The U.S. response is not clear. And that ambiguity creates uncertainty and concern with the Chinese as to what would the Americans do. There's also a lot of literature, for example, that the CSTO's policy is one of ambiguity. So, for example, when either partner, right, either member appeals to the CSTO saying, hey, you need to come and help me, you really don't know if they're going to come to your to your assistance, right? So CSTO for the longest time operated on ambiguity. That's why when Armenia appealed to the CSTO's response was like, we don't know where your borders are. Do you have borders? Have they infringed? Have they violated your sovereignty? Have they not? They gave a bunch of ambiguous answers. And so large states use ambiguity to create uncertainty, which allows them a level of flexibility. Small states use it differently, as we discussed, right? Small states use it to avoid entanglement and to avoid partner defection. So for Armenia, it's a risk mitigation tool, but for powerful countries, it's a power projection tool.
Fascinating. As always, thank you so much for taking the time. And for those who haven't yet read it, I encourage you to do so. It's called Armenia, the 12-Day War and Strategic Ambiguity, the June EVN Security Report. Thank you for joining us.
Always happy to be here.